Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. Just tell me when you want me to stop. I'm good. But when I arrive, I'm looking for what is in that community's DNA. And I'm concerned if a community has experienced traumatic events, or whether or not that trauma is still remaining in the community and they're still experiencing that trauma. And oftentimes the trauma that's in the DNA is actually expressed in discriminatory policies and practices that are being upheld. So if you think about it, have you ever gone to a community and you see where all of the racial groups are segmented into different neighborhoods? Well, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for it. Something has happened. And underneath that, there is an overt or covert policy or practice that actually is enforcing that segmentation. So as a determinant of recovery, we have to look at the history of that community. Now, the first of many determinants of recovery, recovery can be related to race and ethnicity, obviously. There's the most data on that. So what a community looks like in terms of its predominant race can accurately determine their recovery success. And a major contributor to the problem is that existing recovery policies do not distribute post-disaster aid in a fair or equitable way. So for example, Black households affected by disasters have often received much less aid from the Federal Emergency Management Agency compared with their white counterparts. And in communities that have gotten more FEMA aid, the racial wealth gap has grown. So more recovery and mitigation dollars have been invested in white communities, which has helped their housing values increase. It's shortened their recovery time, and it's allowed them to get loans to use their property as collateral for future housing, for additional education costs. So post-disaster property inspections and the difficulty that many communities have in applying for aid and receiving those post-disaster resources and so on, it creates disparities along racial groups. And the unequal outcome along those racial lines in disaster is very well known. It can be used to estimate a community's recovery. Sadly and tragically, that makes race a determinant of disaster recovery. So let's also talk about diverse representation in emergency management leadership. Does the leadership of the local emergency management agency represent the communities they're actually serving? And why does that matter? Well, psychologically, people identify and empathize the most with other people that look like them, that worship like them, that eat the same foods that they do. They identify more with them, and so there's increased planning for them. So what is the reasonable outcome of having emergency managers who may not necessarily understand, represent, or identify with the people living in the communities that they are serving? Naturally, they're going to be more disconnected from those communities if there's no intention to connect. And they will not remove those barriers to engagement with those communities, sometimes until it's too late. So as a result of this uneasy gap and the lack of diversity in leadership, we see unfair policies, programs, and standards that have been developed and that are perpetuated that create and fuel the disproportionate disaster impacts amongst these diverse communities. It's because those leaders have not fully vested in the communities and they don't represent the communities they serve. So another determinant of recovery would be the awareness and planning for social vulnerability. Has a social vulnerability assessment taken place, and has the jurisdiction taken steps to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable? During the preparedness and response phase, I've unpacked some huge elements of bias and missed opportunities for equitable innovations. For example, findings have demonstrated that vulnerable and underserved or marginalized communities are often forced into high risk, high exposure living situations through discriminatory policies like redlining or detrimental infrastructure builds like the BART system in California that plowed right through many African American communities, destabilizing them. Or weaponized eminent domain, taking a community's land and saying it's in the name of the good for the most. There are so many things that contribute to increased risk and hazard exposure for marginalized communities. So if a community's most hazard exposed populations are well known to the planners and emergency managers before a disaster occurs, shouldn't their needs be prioritized? And if a community has repetitive flooding, has poor drainage, has been underinvested in, has subpar housing stock, shouldn't the planning and disaster response consider their plight, their situation as the foundational priority? So, disasters can highlight disparities in treatment and privilege. Absolutely. And it exposes mindsets and motivations. Because when you think about it, many people don't want unfair policies and practices to change, because that would mean changing the status quo, which would mean then you'd have to create equal opportunity for survival after disaster, but also equal opportunity for economic recovery, for increased education, and the list goes on. So I was speaking with a reporter yesterday, and he asked about the comment that Vice President Harris made following landfall of Hurricane Ian in Florida. And I might have missed the comment had he not referenced it, but what she said was, it is our lowest income communities and communities of color that are most impacted by these extreme conditions and impacted by issues not of their own making. And so we have to address this in a way that is about giving resources based on equity and understanding that we fight for equality, but we also need to fight for equity. Understanding that not everyone starts out in the same place. And if we want people to be in an equal place, sometimes we have to account for disparities. And we got to do that extra work. Now, her comments are actually based on fact. The data has demonstrated over and over again the absolute need to prioritize those that have been made vulnerable and marginalized. However, Vice President Harris's comments drew such vitriol, and they drew fire from so many who baited their audiences by saying race is now being factored into aid distribution. Everyone, she's trying to put race into, basically saying that, white people are going to receive services and resources last. Well, that wasn't true. What she was saying was very factual, that we have to be more intentional in how we take care of those who are most vulnerable. So in closing, we have to start doing disasters differently. This status quo of us against them, or the haves against the have-nots, is just not working. And unfortunately, recovery from disaster looks different depending on where you're sitting before the disaster. It should not be a black or white thing, a male or female, gay or straight, wealthy or poor. It is a human right, and it must be elevated as such. Equity for all requires commitment. And we have to embed equity into all of our policies, all of our programs, all of our practices. So let us all begin normalizing the process of prioritizing those that are most in need and ensuring equity in all things. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very enlightening talk. And I love the concept of, differential recovery based on, social determinants of recovery. Perfect concept to tie it all together. Thank you so much. I encourage everyone to look up your book. I guess that probably goes into a lot more detail on that. Thank you. I want to say that I'm looking at the Q&A box, and while we have quite a few speakers, I'm not seeing enough questions. So please, I'm encouraging our audience to put your questions in, type them in. I'm sure that there's some thoughts in your mind, and we'd love to have an engaging conversation after our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Alain Normand. And it is my great pleasure to introduce him. He is an author, lecturer, teacher, and expert in the field of emergency management. He's also the chair of the NGO Alliance and has been since November 2021. Alain has directed relief efforts in many emergency situations in various parts of Canada. He was a consultant to governmental and non-governmental organizations in the Toronto area for a number of years and was instrumental in developing the national standard for emergency management and business continuity. Alain lives in Brampton, Ontario, where he was the emergency manager for the municipality from 1999 until his retirement in early 2021, a wonderful tenure there. He is the outgoing president of the Ontario Association of Emergency Managers, OAEM, and a member of a number of NGO associations dealing with disasters. Alain teaches emergency management at York University and Humber College and has spent over 30 years of his life in the field in one form or another, bringing together knowledge and experience to this field of expertise. I'd like to add that Alain is the recipient of 3 national awards. In 2010, he received the Canadian Award of Emergency Management from the World Conference on Disaster Management for his contribution to the field. In 2019, he was granted the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Risk and Hazard Network. And in 2021, he received the Exemplary Service Award from Public Safety Canada. Interestingly enough, Alain is also the author of a series of novels related to emergency management available on Amazon and Chapters Indigo. Since 2008, he has been working with Chinese governments and academic institutions to help promote emergency management programs as a certified expert by the China State Administration for Foreign Experts and by the China Ministry of Commerce. Alain is also a team lead volunteer for the Canadian Red Cross. Currently, Alain and his wife, Nicole, are consultants with ADRA Canada, in disaster relief, primarily coordinating training of volunteers and responding to emergencies all across Canada. In May 2022, Alain was deployed for 6 weeks by ADRA Canada on a humanitarian mission to Ukraine as logistics manager for the donations management operation, concentrating on food and sanitation donations from neighboring countries and from Canada. Thank you so much, Alain. We do appreciate that you're able to be with us here today. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Long introduction. I'm going to have to get down on a few things here. But thanks for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Should be able to see that. No, it should be the first. There we go. So thanks for this, and definitely I agree wholeheartedly with what Professor, first speaker, Chauncia said. And my point of view, I'm going to present more on the profession and the changes in the profession. I agree that if the people serving the community do not reflect the community, the people are not going to be served in the way that they need. So I totally agree with that, and that's been my goal over the last 30 so years to try to bring in that diversity. So let me start by just a little bit of my background. Milestones in 1992. I was at the public safety in Gatineau, Quebec, and that's how I started really my career in emergency management. I got interested in that, and funny enough, I had to go. There was nothing really in Canada at the time. I had to go to FEMA to get any kind of training. So certainly, I'm very grateful for our neighbors to the south for all the help that I was able to get. I got a lot of training from them. And then eventually I started working with ADRA. ADRA is the Adventist Development and Relief Agency. And they do a lot, they're a humanitarian organization. They're the humanitarian arm of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I worked with them, as a volunteer and as a consultant, in various ways, various disasters with them. A big event that changed my life and certainly made me more aware of the needs was the 1996 Saguenay floods in Quebec, which devastated 12 communities, and over 50,000 people were evacuated. And I was one of the lead coordinators in some of the work of relief there. Then in 1998, we had the Quebec ice storm, which was a huge event as well. It took months and months to recover from that. And demonstrated actually lacked and gaps in emergency management in Canada. I moved to Brampton in 2000 as the emergency manager, 1999 actually, but I started really doing a lot of work with Brampton in 2000. After the Y2K, you might remember that. That was a launch for a lot of things. And then I started teaching and working with York University to develop the educational program that is in existence now, which is really doing very well. Why do I give you that? Well, my background, I had a background in public administration, political science. I did not go into university to learn emergency management. I don't have an academic emergency management background, but I do have some background in public administration, political science. And then I learned and I trained in emergency management from Canadian Emergency Preparedness College, from FEMA, as I mentioned, from EMO, Emergency Management Ontario, and again, the Emergency Preparedness College of Canada, which then reopened and restarted some programs, which unfortunately now is closed, has closed again since, but had some very good, very interesting courses. So why diversity? Why do I want to talk about that? I'm not so much as a pure academic, so I'm not going to give you some studies. I'm going to talk more on personal experience. When I started in emergency management, the work of emergency management was done mostly by provincial employees. Most of the emergency management resided at the provincial level. There was very little at the municipal sector, and Public Safety Canada was really not involved. They were more looking at external to Canada and working with when other countries had disasters, how do we help them? So it's mostly provincial employees. Most of them were actually ex-military or fire or police. So very much that military kind of background, which also, we saw a lot of shelved employees. When you have a change of government, what happens very often is that there's people that you don't know what to do with because they were high-ranking members of the previous government. The new government doesn't want them there, so they move them around, but they can't fire them because there's unions, there's all sorts of rules. So what they do is they try to find a place to put them where they really don't have anything to do. And typically that was emergency management. So they would be, and I know I've met many people who were shelved employees from previous government that were put into these positions in emergency management and had absolutely no clue to what emergency management was about. And basically, at that time when I started, it was the old boys club. Most of the people that were working there were either retired from a previous position, so they were over 50. They were all Caucasian, male, and had really a background in police or fire or military. it was, you know, when we did call it the Old Boys Club. I was actually one of the youngest people there at the time, was in my late 30s and early 40s, you know, and there was some municipal, but very little. It was just basically starting to look at, hey, maybe we should have people at the municipal level that start to do this kind of work. And it grew. And it was basically no private enterprise that had any emergency management. So I'm talking about, you know, when I started almost 30 years ago. So we determined fairly quickly, and I saw that there was a lot of lack, as we said, you know, we were not reflective of the communities that we were serving. So there was a need for change. So a few things happened. The 1998 ice storm was really a major catalyst. A lot of things happened, and particularly some new funding came up. People said, hey, we weren't ready for that. It was devastating. A lot of those shelved employees actually failed, and they were sacked. Now they had a reason to fire them because they weren't doing the job. So a lot of them got fired right after the ice storm because they didn't know how to respond. We had to call on the Army, the military, which was, I mean, they're good people and they do a lot, but that's not their job to do emergency management. And then there's a need for change. So a lot of people realize, hey, we got to find something, got to do something different. 9/11, although it wasn't, of course, 9/11 didn't happen in Canada, it happened in the US, but it had a lot of repercussions in Canada. People said, oh, we're vulnerable. We did have some impact. So for example, when the airports, all the flights were canceled or were grounded, we ended up having a lot of planes grounded and a lot of people stranded in Canada from all over the world, not being able to get back. And we had tons of airplanes there for at least a week or two. And those people needed help, and we had really very little resources. So we started ramping up and said, we got to be ready for these kinds of events. And suddenly what happened is that there was new budgets, so there was money. You know, that was a good time. You know, we say after a disaster is the best time to go and ask for money. So we usually, emergency managers who learned that usually did that. And we did get a lot of funding related to emergency management right after these two events, 1998. And, you know, so by 2004, there was a lot more in the books, and a lot of more budgets. There was also new legislation that said we need to give power to municipalities to govern various levels of government, so that it's not relying on one level only to come and bail everybody out. You can't rely on the military every time something happens. So we need to have power given to municipalities in particular to take action. So new legislation came out, and that helped. And then we had the creation of emergency associations, in particular the Ontario Association of Emergency Managers came in, and that also opened the doors for a lot of different things, and created a belonging, and started the direction to create actually a professional regroupment. We started to become on the road to becoming a profession. Emergency managers are still aiming to be recognized as a profession, and it really started with the associations. And then we had education, and we had programs between 2004 and 2006. We had all of these programs that were created in Canada to allow for education, specifically in emergency management. So York University in particular, Fleming College, Sheridan College, George Brown, the Justice Institute of BC, Royal Roads, which is also in BC, and Brandon University, which is in Manitoba, all started to create programs for emergency management. Why am I giving you all of these? These are change catalysts, because what all of this had is it had a huge impact on this diversity. We started seeing a lot of things. So the profession changed. It went from an incident command kind of function to an incident management. And when you say incident command, again, you're thinking military, you're taking fire, police, and really that militaristic kind of mindset. When you're talking about management, now you're opening the door for a lot of other skills, a lot of other different people that came in. We also, it used to be response-based. We concentrate on response, being able to respond to emergencies. There was nothing about prevention. There was nothing but preparedness, or very little, and very little for recovery. People were pretty much left on their own for recovery. It was that, hey, we put out the fire, now you rebuild the house yourself, that sort of. And then it became also much more of a social discipline instead of being a military discipline. And that change, brought in a lot of diversity. So just the factor that the profession itself changed, we saw a lot of things. What happened on the gender side is that all of these changes opened the door for a lot more women. When I started teaching, I used to have classes which were predominantly male. There was still a basic thinking that this was a male-dominated profession. When I teach today, classes are almost 50-50, almost 50% male, female, which, I've seen that change over the years. Not only that, but we cater a lot more to women's needs in emergency. Again, it goes back to what Chauncia was saying, is that when you have the right people serving the community, you have they are reflective of their community. So in the same way for gender, we needed to have more women to really understand the needs of women in an emergency. And that happened. It started to go in that direction. And then the advanced education also attracted more women. Typically, my experience has been that there's more women that are going into higher education than men, and we saw that because we opened up education. We saw that change in there as well. And then the other thing is that we also started creating international exchange programs. So we saw an influx of international students in all of these universities and colleges. We also had, because Canada is open to a lot of new immigrants coming in and finding out about Canada. Hey, we have disasters in Canada, and understanding that this is a field of study that you could, or a profession that you could abide with. So quickly, we saw a diversity of ethnic background. As I said, when we started, it was all basically Caucasian males, 50 years old and more. And right away, with the introduction of the international program, we saw the ethnic background change dramatically. We saw a lot of different people from different backgrounds, different countries coming into. And because a lot of this education was around the GTA, so the Greater Toronto area, which is already very much a diverse community, we saw that had an impact on the students that we were getting and helping develop, again, the profession with a lot more diversity. So we've seen some change there. The other thing that happened was that there was some new subfields in emergency management that started to emerge. So the health emergency, after the SARS, after H1N1, and now with COVID, we saw that the health emergency aspect opened up, very widely. And typically, the health emergency field caters a lot to women in particular. So we saw a lot of women going into health emergency and opening up the doors again to that diversity. So having more health emergency as a subfield of emergency, but also social services. Social services started to realize, hey, you know what, we have to be better at what we do. We may be very good at doing social service on a day-to-day basis, but when something happens, we're not equipped to do that. So social services started working. In particular, I remember for many years I worked between the Ontario Association of Emergency Managers and the Ontario Social Services Association. We worked together to come up with training programs and to expand so that the social workers would understand emergency management and then emergency managers would understand social services. And then we saw NGOs, certainly Red Cross comes to mind, but a lot of other NGOs started, expanding their role. And because of that, that brought in a lot of other people. The humanitarian aid as well, we realized that, hey, you know what, we need that in Canada as well. It's very nice that we go out and we help other countries every time something happens, but we have disasters happening here as well, and we need that humanitarian aid. So humanitarian aid in Canada has grown. We have, groups like Global Medics. We have groups like Team Rubicon. We have Benedict Disaster Service. All of these groups that typically will go out to other countries are now equipped to be able to help right here in Canada. And certainly Hurricane Fiona was a great example of how a lot of our NGOs came together to allow to do that. And then the transportation field also opened. So with air traffic, rail traffic, and a lot of these emergencies started creating a new subfield for transportation. A lot of people went into transportation emergency management with airlines, with airports, with train and rail, and even transit services are creating opportunities there. So new subfields meant a lot more opportunities, which also help with this diversity. Now, where are we? Well, I see that there's still opportunities. We're not there yet. There's still need for more diversity. We haven't reached the full goal yet, but there's opportunities. I see the fact that we have a lot of faith-based agencies and NGOs that are involved will continue to grow and to expand and the reach. Social services, again, is working very, very strongly in determining new avenues, and then again, diversity here, particularly because social services has also realized that, hey, we need to cater to different ethnic groups. We need to cater to the needs of men, women, children in different ways. And so they've expanded, but since they're not connected with emergency management, they're also opening different avenues on that side as well. One area which we've really has over the last decade actually has really grown is the event coordinations and safety. We do a lot of large crowd events, outdoor concerts, all sorts of things like that. And those we basically allow for new people to come in to the field and attract a different group of people that are not necessarily emergency centric, but have other goals. A lot of people from the security field, which often is filled by a lot of ethnic groups, a lot of these positions. The health and safety aspect, there's a lot of connection now with emergency management, and again, some diversity there. Risk management, the emergency management integration is growing. Security and emergency management is getting more connected. And the private sector is coming on board. Private sectors have realized that, you know what, we need to do something. We need to be ready for emergencies because they're going to affect, and not just the business continuity part, but a lot of them, certainly the transportation area, which has a lot of private transportation agencies, but also the oil and gas. A lot of these agencies that have high risk, the electrical services or infrastructure. So private sector has gone out and said, hey, we need to expand. The fact that also we're seeing more disasters is certainly determining that we need more people to be emergency managers. It used to be that emergency managers used to be only in large communities, large municipal areas would have an emergency manager, would be dedicated. But more and more now we see smaller communities say, hey, we need some help. And so they're regrouping, and together they're hiring people to become the emergency manager for 5 or 6 communities, small communities in an area. We're seeing this move happen a lot. So with the increase in disasters, other levels of government has realized we need to be there. We need to be equipped to respond to these kinds of things. We're seeing more with COVID, definitely wave after wave, but we know that there's not the end. We've got the monkeypox, but there's something new happening. Every few years, we get a new pandemic, a new health issue coming up, and that's going to bring in a lot more needs for emergency management profession and opportunities for people. The escalating conflict. I was in Ukraine in May and June this year, and I saw it. It was my first experience in a conflict in a war zone. I've done a lot of disasters all over the world, but this was the first time I was. And that brings in different parameters. Again, a lot of vulnerable population, but here there's the difference is that everybody in the community is really impacted. There's not the poor and the wealthy. There's a lot less of that. And then when we cater to the needs of absolutely everybody there because they're all facing the same danger. And then a lot of work done on disaster reduction, which we used to be all about response. But we've moved away from that. Now we're also working very strongly on disaster reduction, prevention, mitigation aspects. Economic recovery, which wasn't in the books until probably just the last decade or so, is very nice. to have the response and to be able to help people. We take care of the human needs, and we open shelters and we feed people and we do all that. But a community that has been impacted needs to be able to recover. That means we need to rebuild employment. We need to give incentives for businesses to reopen. We need to help them create opportunities so that the whole community, one of the things that I've seen so many times, which I really don't, is that we bring in resources from outside and donate goods from outside of the community so that the people there are helped. That's very nice. But what it does, it doesn't help the community recover because there's no money flowing into the community. Whereas if we give funding through money, if there's money given to the people affected by disasters, they can buy locally, and that helps the local businesses, creates jobs. So to me, economic recovery, we don't know how to do it yet. We need to learn how to do it, and we need to do a lot better job in economic recovery. And that means we need to have people who have more of a financial understanding and more of a business kind of lingo, and then be able to come in and work with emergency management. And that's a new group of people as well. The fact that we're professionalizing, we're becoming a recognized profession, also opens the doors for other possibilities. And and there may be others. Maybe I'm missing a few, and maybe you may be aware of other. All of this to say that we've changed. We've made a lot of progress. I've seen it, just looking at the classroom environment, what the people that I had that is teaching back, 20 years ago, and the people I'm teaching today is a whole different dynamic, which is great. But maybe there's opportunities that we need to capture in order to continue, because I don't think that we've done yet. There's still need to continue expanding on this diversity and inclusion. And that's about it for me. More of a practical, maybe not very academic presentation, but based on my experience, my findings over the last 30 years. And hopefully this is something useful, at least raises discussions, if not more, and I'm happy to take questions if there are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alain. It definitely was refreshing to see the change and progression over time. As you were recounting things from when you first started to where we are right now. But of course, as both of you have highlighted, there's always more work to do. There's always room for improvement, particularly in light of continued disparities that are brought forward throughout the different cycles of phases of the emergency management cycle. I'm happy to say that we have quite a bit of time for questions and answers. So let's take as much time as we want. If you participants have additional questions, please continue to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. So what I've tried to do is kind of club some of our questions. We have questions around operationalizing some of the stuff that we've been talking about today. And then we also have questions that are specific to individual speakers. But let's start first with questions regarding leadership and people that do emergency management service provision. I'll just read a couple of questions that are all related, and then give an opportunity both to Chauncia and Alain to answer. So here's some questions with respect to the people doing the work of emergency management. What are some potential methods that can be used to ensure more people of different genders, cultures, race, and age are represented in leadership roles? So we've talked about the importance of that, but how can we actually make that happen? And somebody mentions how at their agency, the old guard is still in place. And how do you better integrate diversity into a mostly closed group? And related to that is a question by someone in Canada who is of Indigenous status. and they are able to work well with their indigenous communities as they eat the same foods, have the same beliefs, are able to create that level of trust and build that connection. But they appear physically to be of Scottish descent due to their genetic makeup. So the question with this speaker is, this participant is, how can they, despite their appearance, be able to connect with other groups during disasters when they may look one particular way versus another? So I'll give it over to Chauncia first, and then we'll go to Alain.
Okay, so hello again, everyone. Those are great questions. I think I heard about 3 questions, but all related to really how to infuse more diversity within the field. And the first thing that I would say is being intentional about the outcome. Diversity requires diversifying the field really requires being intentional about that. And so we can see it on the front end when we're creating a job description. Is that job description really addressing the diversity of presentation or diversity of experience or background that you're seeking? We've mentioned just in those last 3 questions about 3 different types of diversity, whether it's experience or coming from a specific background or gender or race, and what type of diversity you're seeking. And so once we look at the job description and we understand that we need to be specific about what the job requires, not so much what we've always done before. So if you do what you did before, you're going to get the same type of people, right? You're going to get the same group of resumes. So let's look at what the job actually requires, because truth be told, there's a significant chance a lot of people could do that job that look nothing like the people that have been hired to do it before, right? And even after we have hired those that we think are representative of diversity, we need to make sure the environment is inclusive and that we are really celebrating belonging. And so, you know, when we look for a diversity for some in terms of gender, for example, and the fire department and other male-dominated fields do this frequently, the next step is to then begin understanding, well, what does our culture say about introducing a new element of diversity? So if we do bring in more women, does our culture support that? Are we still going to do the same things and make the same comments or do a lot of the similar behaviors that we did before? Because what's going to happen is they're going to leave if they don't feel like they belong. And, you know, I've had that experience before myself, where I walk into a room of men and they stop talking. Now I'm like, well, what were you talking about before I got here? I want to be in on the conversation. And it's like, no, it wasn't for your ears. Well, now I feel like I don't belong. And so, you know, if that keeps happening, I don't think I belong in this culture, in this environment. And so that's something to think about. So I would just say be intentional. And for those that were concerned about the way they look when they're working with diverse communities, I can tell you, I've been an emergency manager for 23 years, and I've worked with all types of communities. It's not so much what you look like, it's your perspective. What is the perspective that you bring? If you are bringing a perspective to that community, or even planning for that community that says, my perspective is what has to be considered first, or you're not even questioning if your perspective is influencing or biasing the outcome, then that is going to be what creates the problem. So really looking differently is not what's going to stop you. It's your perspective. Is that something that needs to change? Because like I said, we've worked with indigenous communities, it doesn't matter. It's, am I taking the time to understand that community and putting them first, a people first approach? So I'll turn it over to Alain.
Yeah, thank you so much. Before you go, Alain, just a follow-up with what you said. Thank you so much. I love the idea of being intentional and just going back to the basics with respect to, you know, our HR processes, what's in our job description. And when people are in, is our culture actually going to make them feel welcomed? But there's another question here that's related regarding, you know, even though it's good to say, at the end of the day, it is often who you know that gets the job, like that helps you get the job. So you know, this participant is talking about former first responders or military, or anybody who might have connections with people that are already there. So you know, how do we break that? Is that possible? Who you know versus what you know?
Yeah, no, thanks. Absolutely. And that's the challenge that we're facing in this field, is that right now the people that are hiring understand absolutely nothing about emergency management. You know, unfortunately, the HR people have no clue. And I fought with my HR people in Brampton for years to try to get them to understand what I really needed. You know, and I was fortunate enough that I was able to bring a lot of diversity in my group. I had to, you know, black, white. You know, I had people from Afghanistan, I had people from Nigeria, from Jamaica, and then some more local people. You know, I had quite a variety in my staff. I was able to do that because I was insisting on making sure that we had in our community, that we were able to cater to the needs of all the different people from different ethnic, also different religion. You know, I mean, we don't. It's not a question we ask when we hire somebody, but having that religious panoply and having a variety of religions. You know, so I had on my staff, I had people who were Sikhs, I had people who were Christians, and I had people who were Muslims. You know, and so I was able to get you know, a lot of variety. But the problem is that the people who make the policies, you know, have absolutely no clue to what emergency management is about. And so what we need to do more is we need to start educating the people who make policies, getting them to understand what the fact that we've had, you know, I look back at COVID and I was amazed to see that we had the premier of the province going on TV almost every day for months, you know, and talking about emergency management when he knows absolutely nothing about the field. Where was the actual emergency manager? Why didn't we let the emergency managers come and talk to the public and tell them what was going on, what was being done for them? Why does it have to be always the politician showing up there when there's something that they know absolutely? I basically, in my emergency management, in my EOC, my Emergency Operations Center in Brampton, I kicked out the mayor. I didn't want the mayor there. The mayor had absolutely nothing to do with emergency because it's an operational center. We know how to respond to emergencies. When we had something to do there, you know, I called the mayor when we needed him to sign papers, and that's it. They said, here, sign here. Thank you. Very good. You can go back to your office. That was, you know, because that's not the people the politicians know nothing about that. And they're really, you know, they're too far removed, but something happens and they want to be seen as the leaders and knowing it. So that's our challenge. I think if we want to be able to change anything in emergency management, we need to go and work with the politicians and get them to, you know, either get out of our way or go and take some education in emergency management to be able to know what you're talking about. That I think that's going to change. I can say one thing, you know, the question about Indigenous also, I was fortunate that I went and I spent some time up north a few years ago. I went to do some training with one community in Lexer near Sioux Lookout because that community there, the chief, the band council chief, was adamant that he did not want to rely on other governments to be able to bail them out every time they had an emergency. He says, we want to become autonomous. I want my community, my people to be able to take care of themselves. And so we went there. He said, I need you to train our people so that we can do it. We never rely on other level of government. We went there, spent a week with them, trained them, got them as much as we could, and then stayed in touch with them afterwards. And now they're very proud to say, we can take care of our own emergencies. We don't need to have other governments come and bail us out. And I think that's a place where we need to encourage those communities to be able to take care of themselves and their own, because the people that are there in those communities know their community, they know their residents, they're better able to cater to the needs of those people. In particular, when you've got these special groups like indigenous communities, reserves and places where they're congregated there, they're centered there. So I think that's it. And after that, if we can work with HR and get HR to understand a little bit more about what we do, maybe we can get them to give job descriptions which will be more reflective of what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you both so much. That was wonderful. On the same topic of operationalizing equity, diversity, inclusion in disaster and emergency management, we have questions around how you both envision normalizing the inclusion and prioritization of marginalized and or stigmatized communities through disaster preparedness and planning. So not only about the people there, but also about tangible steps that local communities can take to ensure equity for recovery. So, what are some things that people that are directly affected by disasters, what are some things that they can do? And then I have a follow-up question on actually whether it's the responsibility of the community to actually ensure equity for recovery.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's how do you normalize the inclusion and prioritization of marginalized communities? So, I mean, one of the things is what I was speaking to before, which is really conducting a vulnerability assessment. So, when you go into an emergency management organization, regardless of whether it's in the private sector or public sector, government, academic institution, one of the first things you're always going to want to do is conduct a community assessment, a profile, get a profile of who you're serving and what their needs are and what their issues are. And as I mentioned before, also understanding the historical significance of the events that have occurred in that community, whether it's like whether it's a community that has experienced a racial breakdown, or whether there's an anti-poverty bias that is very prevalent. You need to know what are the issues of the community, but then take it a step further and do a social vulnerability assessment. And we're not just looking at the basics of census, how many homes am I serving? You really want to know who the people are. You want to get a good idea of their socioeconomic status. And you also want to understand the things that are not as well known and that may not come to the forefront of thought when planning, which might be how many have cars, how many have access to transportation routes. A lot of that information is available in public and private sector databases. Even how many single moms or single dads are living in the community. And what you're able to do then is really incorporate that information into your planning process, because you're going to want to be able to pre-position resources or even request resources immediately after disaster to assist those more vulnerable communities. So one of the first things you can do is get to know your community. And the next, it would be to integrate community-based organizations into the operational structure. So when we're activated, not even just when you're activated, but also when you're training, you're inviting community-based organizations that are serving those more vulnerable communities to come in to your EOC environment or to come into your planning environment, and you're working with them before a disaster ever occurs. You're understanding and learning, and you're also appointing community ambassadors. So if this happens, if I call you, can you get the word out? And so you're looking for creative and more innovative ways to achieve those equitable outcomes. And you're also normalizing the process. And by doing so, you're prioritizing those vulnerable groups and better positioning yourself to serve their needs in times of disaster. So I hope that answers the question. I think you had another question about how communities can be more prepared. And I actually agree with Alain on that, which is to say that you can focus on a more communal mindset, which is neighbors actually being active and taking care of neighbors. The way disasters have become less singular and they're more compounded now, they're happening more frequently with more intensity and all of these things. You gotta get to know your neighbors and find out who's more vulnerable. And so one of the programs that we created in Tampa was Meet a Neighbor, Save a Life. If you know there's an elderly person living by themselves with no access to a vehicle, with no children around, then try to find out how you can be of assistance if they are needing an evacuation plan. Do you have an emergency plan? So it's neighbor taking care of neighbor, and things like that. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you so much. Certainly. Alain?
Yeah, I definitely like that answer. And we've seen a lot of movement in working with more on a neighborhood kind of level. We're in many places, we're trying to piggyback on the neighborhood watch program, which is more of a policing and security kind of, but we're saying, well, why can't they also be equipped to help during disasters? They know the community, they know their neighbors, they know the people, so they know who's going to need some help. So we're working on more neighborhood kind of emergency preparedness programs. I've seen that in many communities now happening a lot more. So the other thing that's happening is that we're not alone. Emergency management is not the only field that is looking at this issue of diversity and inclusion. I've seen that in many, certainly social services has been working in that direction for many years. They have done a lot of work, a lot of studies, and not just in Canada, in the US. I've talked to friends that I have in Australia and New Zealand, in the UK, in Germany, and even to a certain extent in China. They're starting to recognize now that, hey, maybe we need to change our ways a little bit. So a lot of movement now into that from other fields as well. So social services, public health, definitely, but also even those old boys club, kind of the old guard. The fire department has recognized that, we're not diverse enough. We need to open the doors for more, a different ethnic group. But also now we are seeing more and more women firefighters. There used to be a thinking, no, women can't do that. It's too tough. It's too difficult for them to do. Well, that's changing. And we're seeing now more and more women actually entering the firefighting field. So that, and a lot more police officers are female, and paramedics. So with the inclusion of into those, again, a lot of these people, when they retire, eventually move into emergency management. We see that, and that's not going to stop. That's going to continue. They're looking for a second career, if you want. But if now we see more diversity in those paramilitary kind of groups, when they move into their second career, there's going to be a lot more of that diversity as well there. So I think just the way that other fields are changing is also helping to raise that awareness for us. We got to take the good parts that other fields are bringing, and we got to use that to our advantage as well. That's sort of my answer to that.
Perfect, thank you. On the same topic of including members of the public or communities that are affected, there's a question here around how you suggest getting more youth involved in understanding how they can affect the emergency management field. And the comment is that youth, starting as early as middle school, have a lot of excellent ideas, but they don't know about planning for their communities or recovery, mitigation, health, resilience policy as it relates to emergency management. So what are some things we could do to encourage youth to get involved? For anyone.
Well, I think that's a great suggestion. One thing that I've found success with is partnering with affiliated organizations that are hosting the youth, like Boys and Girls Club, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, actually bringing them to the EOC, the Operations Center, or creating projects for them to participate in. In addition, after a disaster, there's a lot that can be done with those groups in terms of working at coming to the warehouse and actually seeing how we distribute foods and resources, and actually viewing it and understanding it from a very practical perspective. Also, as emergency managers, we all do a lot of presentations in the community and even in the private sector when, you have to present quite a lot. So making an effort to participate in those opportunities where you can go to those schools, where you can actually be present and demonstrate different elements of diversity. I was always very intentional to go to different colleges so that students entering their first or second year and community colleges would get to see an African-American female emergency manager and give them that perspective. And so now within our organization, we have a program called Hurricane. And our Hurricane program actively works to expose young women to emergency management and all of the associated fields, so they can spend a week with us and really learn all about the field of emergency management and homeland security.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I've attended a lot of career fairs over the years to try to encourage people to come into emergency management, to understand what it is, and to become, more open to this kind of to our profession. So that's one area. I find also the other area, the other entry point, if you want, that I found for youth is through NGOs. It's difficult to bring in youth and give them a practical experience in an EOC. An EOC is a hectic place when whether it's a real disaster or it's an exercise, it's hectic. You can't really have any youth in there. Plus, there's all sorts of issues with risk management, and so it's difficult. But NGOs do all kinds of work directly with the public, which is related to emergency management, and it becomes an entry point. And I've seen a lot of, particularly faith-based group bringing in the young church youth, bringing them into the disaster relief program in various ways. Churches and mosques and temples have a way. They've already got a youth people that are participating in their program. So if they have an emergency or a disaster relief program, or even a social support program, they can bring in the youth to that, and it opened the door to them to be more interested in the field of emergency management. So I found that that's an area and then a good entry point to have there. But again, doing presentations, whether it's high school or colleges, doing presentation about what is emergency management. And I find that there's more and more of an interest, because I go to these places and with COVID, with hurricanes now reaching Canada more often, with the tornadoes that we hear more about, with flooding, we're getting all these disasters a lot more often, and people are saying, well, is there anybody doing something, and who's taking care of that? And so there's a lot more questions coming from the youth, which means there's a greater interest, and we need to be there to capture that interest and channel it towards the proper education.
Thank you so much. So we have around 4 minutes left before the, actually, no, we have time. Sorry, my apologies. We have enough time to go through a couple more questions. I have one, and then we'll go through some of the questions that are targeted specifically to Chauncia or Alain. So my question is, we have a speaker here who has a lot of experience from the US side, and then across the border, another speaker with a lot of experience from Canada. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on some of the differences that we both understand issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in emergency management in both countries, and how we are addressing them. So if you have any insight on, the country differences here in North America, I would be very pleased to hear your thoughts on that, because it's something up my alley in terms of my research. So let's see if I could get some insight from you guys.
Yeah, I would say that, I think there are more similarities probably than differences, but I will say the clientele served and the mindset of the clientele served might be different. So, you know, depending on where you live in America, you definitely will get a whole different challenge. So the community, there's definitely communal mindsets. And so that's a different, that's something different to consider, because you want to know the behavior of your community and what they're inclined to do in your preparedness and decision making. I would also say that the complexities of the historical discrimination that has occurred with Indigenous populations is very similar to what we've experienced here in terms of our Indigenous tribes, as well as our immigrant groups. And, you know, we have a horrible history of slavery and also Japanese internment. There's just a lot of very, a lot of past and in many cases present history, past history and present issues that affect every emergency manager. And so we're looking at the past, but we're also looking at, oh my gosh, this is happening right now. What do we do right now? This is unbelievable. And so that is probably something that might be unique to America. But also I could see that across the way, you probably have similar issues as well, from what I'm hearing. So
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of similarities, and certainly with everything related, particularly to indigenous communities, we're struggling. The whole residential school debacle is just amazing, and it's mind blowing, and really we haven't really understood how to deal with all of that and the consequences, and there's still a lot of healing that needs to happen, and I'm not sure how we're going to ever achieve it. But yeah, history has not been very good in Canada either. So we have a lot of similarities. That's right. I think one of the major differences that I see is in the way that emergency management in Canada is very much a bottom-up kind of approach, whereas in the States, there's a mentality that, well, if I can't do it, no problem, FEMA will come and bail me out, right? So it's more of a top-down kind of a mentality. So that's one of the major differences that I've seen in the field of emergency management. Here, everything starts at the local municipality and it stays at the local municipality. We'll never have Public Safety Canada coming to your community and saying, okay, get out of the way, we're going to take over. Whereas we've seen that in FEMA. I remember Hurricane Katrina, where FEMA came over and started to say, well, we're going to take over this whole thing. You guys don't know what you're doing, and get out of the way. Whereas actually, missing the point that the local community could have probably done a lot more if they had simply been provided with the right tools, because they knew their population. And we're talking about, equity, and definitely Katrina was terrible for that, because that was a community was predominantly Black, and they were underserved because they brought in people from the outside who knew nothing about the community, and they take over. So I think that's one of the major differences that we have in Canada, that may have an impact, because we aim to start with the community, so we have more chances of having people who are representative of that community. And the fact also in Canada, we have a lot of new immigrants. I mean, most of the people in Canada, most of the population in Canada has only been in Canada for about 20 years. We have a very large influx of immigrants, and it's going on and on. But that means that there's a lot of the people that are here, that the majority of the people that are living in Canada now really have little history in Canada. They come from other countries, which has a greater diversity. I know there's a lot of diversity in the US as well, but I think we have a different kind of paradigm because of the way that our people, that we've populated Canada. So I think that those are factors that may have an impact as well. And maybe because of that, we might be even more open to that diversity and that ethnic particularly on the ethnic side. I don't know so much on the gender side, but on the ethnic side, I think because of the fact that we're all immigrants in one way or another, and we realize, with the exception of the indigenous people, everybody else is an immigrant in one way or another. So we're conscious of that, and that may have an impact on how we see others as well. Just my two cents.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alain and Chauncia. So what we'll do is we'll close with some questions that I have for you both individually. So the first one that I have, Chauncia, is for you. I'll just read the comment, all right? I recently was surprised to hear an EMDEI agency removing the term equity and replacing it with opportunity. The very conscious decision was apparently pressured by the conservative government and community on the basis that equity of achieving some outcomes is not possible for this government. What are your thoughts on this decision as an EM entity that champions equity? How would you approach working with them?
Well, I'm not sure I would work with them. I don't think I'm what they would want to work. I don't think I represent who they would want to work with. But equity has become very politicized. And as we spoke about the vice president's comments, just saying equity in some areas is almost akin to saying, something racial, or saying we are prioritizing a specific race above another. In our in our country, unfortunately, power shifting is happening before our eyes, and it's terrifying for some folks. And a lot of them are perceiving the power shifting along racial lines. And so for those that are that haven't seen enough equity, like myself, I haven't seen the equity, I haven't experienced it. We're still going to promote, more people committing to equity in disasters. It's critical because it will save lives. And so, I would just say that, it's unfortunate, but the word has become politicized. And I don't perceive that anyone doesn't really understand what we're trying to say when we say address those who have needs. It's an intentional politicization. It's intentional, and it's meant to be destructive. And so I just find it unfortunate. But hopefully they will not prevail in making it a buzzword that is harmful.
Thank you so much for your honesty there. Alain, we have a question here, kind of touching on how you expressed that you don't have necessarily formal education in the field of emergency management. So the question is, what is the role of education versus experience, having a say in the decision-making positions that affect a diverse society that we live in today? And also, just as an aside, we have another individual here who's doing their a degree in epidemiology, and is wondering if you can share some advice on how to get a job in the field.
Okay, interesting. Well, I'll start with that. Really the entry point for any health emergency management is really through public health, because if you don't have the public health background, they're not going to hire you as emergency, because the positions are usually for health emergency are usually prepared and developed because somebody in public health says, hey, we need some help. We need to know how to do emergency management as well, beyond just doing public health. So, I think that you need to look into how I get to public health first, and then within public health, how can I expand so that I can actually do also, emergency management? That's my advice from what I've seen from experience. Now, it may change. I think COVID has brought in a lot of things. Another area you might want to look at is actually through social services, because social services was heavily involved into the COVID response, because while public health was doing vaccinations and testing and health advice, all of the vulnerable population weren't really catered to for their other needs by the public health. It was social services that did it. Take for example, it was very nice for public health to say to seniors, stay home. You're vulnerable, you're in danger, don't go anywhere. Well, that's very nice, but what do? If you're a senior and you're stuck at home, how do you get grocery? How do you get medication? How do you pass the time when you're bored? So that's not something the public health took care of. It's really social services. Social services did the emergency management, emergency support and recovery for the COVID, not public health. So there's different avenues. You need to look at where do I really want to be, and look at the different avenues. And even though you may have a degree in epidemiology, it may not be the right career that you're looking for. You need to be open to other things. Now, I forgot the first question. Can you repeat again?
The first one was, what's the role of formal education versus experience?
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, so I think there's a need for both. So more and more now, the positions that are being advertised will ask for education. For emergency management, they will ask for a degree, at least a bachelor's, if not more. So that's a given. So now I strongly encourage people to look into having at least a bachelor's degree, or having a bachelor's plus a certificate in emergency management to compensate for to give you that background in the emergency management. However, and I fought with HR for many years on that. They will ask you also for 5 years experience, and that's very nice. But when you just come out of university with a degree, where do you get those 5 years experience? And the problem is that the salaries that they were offering for entry-level positions into emergency management are so low that the people that have 5 years experience are already making way beyond the amounts that they are offering there. So the people that have the experience are not interested in those positions, but the people who are interested in those positions don't have the experience. So how do you resolve that? So I've had lots of discussions with my HR people saying, drop that 5 years, bring it down to maybe 2 years of related experience, and having something where you have transferable skills, not necessarily emergency management experience, but something where you've been in a leadership position, or you've been in a social service position, or you've been in an NGO, or you've done some work with the public. There's different ways. And so we need to look at transferable skills for the experience part. But the education is becoming more and more important. Not only that, but if you want to move up in there, it's very nice to get into. And if you manage that first degree, that bachelor's degree, or that certificate gets you in, opens the door. But then if you want to be promoted, you want to move up the ranks, you want to get to better positions, higher ranking positions, you're going to be in competition with people who have a master's degree and PhDs now, and the likelihood of you getting that position is going to be less and less. So what I usually tell my students is, I says, right now, you don't have a mortgage, you don't have 3 children, you don't have 2 cars, you don't have all of these debts and all these. Now's the time to go and get higher education. Go and go for education while you can still take the time to do it. Yeah, it's expensive, it's more difficult. But there are programs, there are loans and bursaries, and so go out, but do it now, because if you wait, and then when you have your mortgage, your kids, your family, you won't find the time to go back to school and do it again. So do it now, get the education while it's still relatively easy to get. That way, once you're competing for those higher ranking positions, you will have those degrees that they're asking for, and on top of that, you'll be able to have that experience, because you'll have a number of years, so you'll be well positioned to move up the ranks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. for that answer, very comprehensive answer. And once again, I'd like to extend my deepest appreciation to both Chauncia and Alain for sharing their expertise and knowledge with us today. There's one comment that somebody put in the Q&A box that I think sums up the entire talk that we've had today, and it is as follows. Sometimes these reminders are enough to redirect and shift the mindset. A lot of takeaways to feel reinvigorated as an emergency management manager. So thank you so much to both of you. Thank you to all our participants. Thank you to the organizers of this speaker series. I do hope that everyone benefited. And of course, there is the recording that you are more than welcome to watch again and again to come back to these important reminders. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Mamuji, for moderating, and to Alain and Chauncia for your presentations. And also thank you very much to everyone who attended and who participated in the Q&A and asked questions. I do just quickly want to share my screen just to inform everybody of our next session. In 2 weeks, we are having our session 4 of 6 with speakers Dr. Noemi Gonzalez Bautista and Susana Sealy, who is a PhD student at the University of Delaware. And they will be covering the topics of deconstructing gender binary and the topics of identity and multicultural competency in emergency management. So everyone who's registered will be getting a reminder through their emails like they do for every session, but I also just want to remind everyone who's here in case they want to mark it off on their calendar now. And yes, like Dr. Mamuji said, the recording will be up as soon as possible on the event website where everyone registered and has the information. So yeah, thank you again to everybody today. And I'll stop the recording here.